We're going to start with news stories, and the two stories that I picked are fascinating because they look at essentially the same trend and provide a completely different perspective. So let's start with the first one. This is from the Washington Post, September 12th, 2018. For the first time since 2010, America's progress on health insurance stalls. And looking at the same trend, the New York Times says, despite attacks on Obamacare, the uninsured rate held steady last year. So I would look at this and go, oh, hey, good news. And I'd look at the Washington Post story just as a casual reader and go, wow, that doesn't sound so great. So the underlying facts are actually very important here to know.
Right. I think you have two things going on. Number one, people are showing, I'll call it, their bias as to how to think about what's going on. The writer of one story seemed to have one sort of point of view. The writer of this story has another. And yet they agree on the facts. The numbers are the numbers. Now, I'm not sure a headline that says, the number of percentage of uninsured has stayed constant year over year. And then you could say, despite new administration, you could say, despite the Obamacare laws, it doesn't go up. But despite the new administration, it doesn't go down. But those are all conclusory. The truth is, it stayed flat. And that, to me, is the important thing for people to have in mind. And then they can apply their judgments around it.
Journalistic side note here. In classic traditional newspaper newsrooms, the copy editors write the headlines, not the reporters, whereas in fast-moving online news sites, typically the reporters write the headlines and then the editors reshape them.
But even if you go past the headlines here, they're different. So I hear you, but it still reads differently, and who knows how to think about that. What I know is about between 8 and 9% of people were uninsured in both years, and people can draw their own conclusions as to why. People can decide whether we really need to try to drive for 100. Is that realistic? Those are all questions that you can entertain, but they've got to be based on the same fundamental fact. The number is flat. And saying that in a clearer way, I would think, would be a good starting point.
Yep. And I will say one last thing on this. I don't mean to be in media critic mode here, but if you go back to the Washington Post story, there are a lot of adjectives and adverbs in this news story. From 2010 to 2016, the uninsured rate fell dramatically, nearly in half, as tens of millions of more people were signed up for health insurance under the Affordable Care Act. See, it's a challenge. As a journalist, you got to have your stories stand out and catch attention. And I think sometimes facts are not nearly as grabby for the typical reader as adjectives and adverbs.
No, they're not. I agree they're not. Now, they said uninsured rate fell dramatically, nearly in half. Well, that must mean it fell from about 18% to about 9%.
Right.
I'm not saying that's not dramatic or it is dramatic, but it's clearer to me to say 18 went to 9.